When it comes to tragic Hollywood starlets, the story of Susan Peters might just take the cake. When Peters first stepped onto the scene, people thought she was destined to become the next big thing. Nobody could have foreseen that a single disaster would derail all of her hopes and dreams. When she and her husband went on a relaxing hunting trip, they never imagined it would turn into the greatest nightmare of their lives. Even as Susan Peters fought for survival, her persistent misfortune led to one of the most brutal ends the entertainment industry ever saw. Grab some tissues, folks, because this story is a sure-shot tearjerker. Born Susan Carnahan in July 1921, Susan Peters was the first child of Robert Carnahan and his wife Abby. She had absolutely no connection to showbiz and lived a tranquil life with her parents and younger brother in Spokane, Washington. But this was no fairy tale childhood. Before long, a family move to Portland brought Peters face to face with unspeakable tragedy. When she was only 7 years old, a devastating loss blindsided little Susan. A car accident claimed her father's life and turned her own life upside down. This sudden loss motivated yet another move, and soon her family joined her French grandmother in Los Angeles. Unbeknownst to Peters, this was where her own star would someday rise. She never actually dreamed about becoming an actor. She was a deeply caring person and actually wanted to become a doctor. Determined to become a doctor, Susan Peters concocted a brilliant plan. Her thinking was logical. Actors make good money, and if she was any good, she'd be able to help her family and put herself through medical school. So, when given the option of taking a cooking course or a drama class, Peters didn't hold back. She chose drama. No one could deny that Peters was a total stunner. In fact, it's possible that her beauty won her very first screen test. When a talent scout sat in on one of her classes and spotted her angelic face, he knew he'd found something special. Even though her teachers warned him that she was one of their worst actresses, he recognized the face made for the camera when he saw one. When Peters graduated from Hollywood High in 1939, she was an esteemed company. Her graduating class included Jason Robards, Sheila Ryan, and Dorothy Morris, all of whom would go on to have long-running careers of their own. By association, one would imagine Peters would have a similar career arc, but instead, her path veered in a different direction altogether. Despite her later struggles, Peters' career started off on the right foot. For starters, family friend writer Salka Vertel introduced her to all her Hollywood connections, and Peters impressed one of them in particular, George Cukor. He gave her a bit part in his film Susan and God, starring the inimitable Joan Crawford. And when I say bit part, I mean she was barely in it. Peters had no lines, and she wasn't even mentioned in the credits. But despite her small role, Peters' first acting gig morphed into every actor's worst nightmare. All Peters' role entailed was for her to be a part of the background in a couple of the film's party scenes. Although she literally only had to show up, she got so nervous when she saw the camera for the first time that she fainted. Thankfully, she overcame her nerves to shoot her scenes, and walked away with an invaluable experience. Nothing good ever comes easily, and Peters knew that. She continued doing every screen test that came her way, while still polishing up her acting skills. Luckily, Warner Bros. Noticed her hard work and rewarded her by offering her a contract. But if they thought they could control or mold Peters like some of their other actors, they were in for a perplexing surprise. After appearing in a number of blink and you'll miss it roles in several Warner Bros. Films, Peters got her first big break. She landed a small but credited role in a full-length feature film titled Santa Fe Trail. Although she did quite well, the role didn't lead to any bigger or better opportunities, and this seemed suspicious, or at least a little bit strange. This could have been a coincidence, or something else entirely. Peters' difficult reputation may have come around to haunt her. Studio executives weren't too happy with Peters' stubbornness. They faced it again during press promotions of Santa Fe Trail, when Peters locked herself in her room and refused to come out for interviews because she found them overwhelming. She admitted in later interviews that she felt sorry that she hadn't been a good sport at the time. To her dismay, it wasn't long before handfuls of golden opportunities started slipping through her fingers. At one point, Peters had the dubious distinction of being one of the most screen-tested girls in Warner Bros. Lot. Sadly, none of these tests resulted in a promising role. She continued to get few tiny parts in some of the bigger films, but these were too small to be of any real consequence. If it wasn't obvious that she was being deliberately overlooked by now, one particular incident made it painfully clear. Peters' screen test for 1941's Sergeant York was absolutely perfect, according to Photoplay magazine. The only reason she didn't win the role was because she was too young. But this clearly wasn't the reason, as the role eventually went to someone even younger, Joan Leslie. To add insult to injury, the film Sergeant York went on to become a huge box office hit. When one door closes, another opens. Just as Peters started questioning her life choices, another studio swooped in to save her. MGM and director S. Sylvan Simon contracted her to play a supporting role in his upcoming movie Tish. She tested for the part and won it, and began filming in 1942. Did this mean things were finally looking up for Peters? Although critics would later admit it had its merits, Tish didn't translate into a hit right off the bat. Even so, it was a definite win for Peters. The cinematographer ensured that she looked her loveliest throughout the film, and her acting was so real she practically jumped off the screen. Now more than ever, Peters was impossible to ignore. Still, her success wasn't her only reason to celebrate. Tish gave her an even bigger gift, one that made her the happiest girl in the world. While filming, Peters met the love of her life, Richard Quine. In fact, even in the movie, he played the role of her love interest, and before either of them knew it, sparks ignited. Their chemistry was undeniable. Even though Quine was a married man, these two lovebirds threw caution to the wind and started a passionate affair. After all, Peters was at her absolute peak, and with her striking features and alluring gaze, she undoubtedly stole his heart. When Quine secured a divorce, Peters saw a happily ever after in the making. And that's exactly what she got, at least for a little while. For Peters, there was no looking back after her brush with success. MGM signed a long-term contract with her, and she started getting offers for better roles. The next film she signed was also opposite Quine, and it was doubly special because the two announced their engagement while working on it. It would also lead to her next big film, Random Harvest. Finally, Susan Peters' star had risen. But unbeknownst to the glowing actress, her success came with an expiration date, and the clock had already started ticking. In November 1943, Peters married Quine in a private ceremony in a church in LA. Family, friends, and fans attended the joyous ceremony, and Peters drifted down the aisle wearing her great-grandmother's wedding dress. The couple were over the moon and deeply in love. It seemed like every girl's dream come true. And then, in a single moment, it all fell apart. When Peters and Quine headed out on a relaxing hunting trip, they never thought it would turn into the greatest nightmare of their lives. Peters was supposedly picking up a hunting rifle for her friend when it accidentally went off and pierced her through the abdomen. The result? A bullet tore through her and damaged her spine. As Peters lay on the ground, bleeding out, she recalled feeling like she was floating in the air. As shock leaked through her system, she remembered telling herself not to panic because she wanted to stay alive. Quine rushed her to the hospital where she had to undergo emergency surgery. And although doctors managed to save Peters' life, they couldn't save her from a devastating diagnosis. The damage to her spine left her paralyzed from the waist down. Peters would have to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. When she first came to, Peters seemed determined to overcome her handicap and even succeeded in taking a few steps. However, a final checkup at Los Angeles Hospital ended in a disappointing relapse, and they kept her for 7 months before finally allowing her to go home. But sadly, her struggles didn't end there. In fact, they had only just begun. As if things weren't hard enough for Peters already, she had to deal with the dizzying blow of losing her beloved mother. Abby Carnahan passed in late 1945, not long after she saw her only daughter come home. She had kept a long vigil next to Peters' bedside the entire time she'd been in hospital, and perhaps her sorrow for her daughter's condition became too much for her to bear. Although this tragedy devastated Peters, and as bleak as her future seemed, she tried her best to keep her eyes locked on the horizon. It didn't seem that Peters and Quine were going to let her handicap get in the way of their marriage. Peters always spoke highly of Quine, claiming that she felt he loved her even more since the accident, and gushing about what a wonderful nurse he was to her. He in turn praised his wife enthusiastically, saying he found her more beautiful than ever, and admired her magnificent attitude. They must have sincerely believed in their love, which is why they decided to take the next big step. Peters had once declared that she wanted to work for a little while longer and then retire and raise a large family. Both she and Quine had wanted lots of children, but after the accident, they had to face the facts. Peters wouldn't be able to have a baby. They had no choice but to turn to adoption, and in April 1946, they welcomed a 10-day-old baby boy whom they named Timothy. True to form, Peters remained positive about the whole experience. God always leaves a loophole to crawl through when trouble strikes. Peters hadn't lost the will to live. An article about her in Photoplay noted the courage in her big, wide gray eyes, and compared it to the courage shown by officers who returned wounded from war. There was a resilience there, and beyond that, she had plenty of ideas. She wanted to work in radio, and even wrote a series of articles on her Hollywood friends for Photoplay. Most of all, she wanted to get back to work. Unfortunately, she had no idea just how difficult that would be. Peters had some great ideas for films that would allow her to shine. She pitched the idea of starring in a biopic about Connie Boswell, a singer who'd also been paralyzed from the waist down after an accident, or a film based on a bedridden journalist, Nellie Revel. But to her dismay, her studio brutally turned her down. They just weren't willing to give her ideas a chance. Fiercely stubborn as always, she broke her contract. With determination in hand, she turned to Columbia Pictures. This time, when Peters made her pitch, the studio listened. She wanted to act in an adaptation of The Sign of the Ram, a novel about a disabled woman who uses her handicap to manipulate the people in her life. This was exactly the kind of emotional range she wanted to steep herself in, a challenge certain to showcase her acting talent. Peters was extremely optimistic about the movie's reception, but unfortunately nothing went as planned. Sadly, The Sign of the Ram was a disappointment at the box office, and received bad reviews from the critics at large. They didn't fault Peters' performance, but she felt she deserved a better comeback than this. But if you think that Peters' run of tragedy and missteps was coming to a well-deserved end, think again. Just as her professional career veered off course, so did her personal life. Although neither of them had given the world an inkling that there was trouble in paradise, Peters and Quine separated from each other in 1948, just after The Sign of the Ram's production wrapped up. Peters made claims nobody had ever suspected. She spouted that Quine mistreated her, that he was cruel and sometimes wouldn't speak to her for days on end. Peters never said more on the sensitive subject, and neither did Quine. The divorce became final in September 1948, with Peters getting custody of little Timothy and receiving $300 a month in child support. Peters moved to Lemon Cove, California, to her brother's cattle ranch. Doctors had previously advised her to work 1 month a year, and she ignored their advice, performing on stage and television and pushing her limits every chance she got. It seemed like all that reckless neglect of her own health was finally catching up to her, and she was about to pay the price. Peters had always been slender and petite, and after her hunting accident, doctors recorded Peters' weight at only 80 pounds. Her relationship with food had also been rather unhealthy, and she admitted that she'd given up eating whenever Quine tormented her with a silent treatment, but it didn't get any better. After she moved in with her brother, she started eating even less. In fact, it seemed like she was a completely different person from the woman who'd struggled to live, who'd maintained a firm grasp on hope and willed herself to carry on. Where was she now? In her last visit to the doctor, Peters told him that she felt it would be best for everyone if she was no more. Over the course of the next 2 months, Peters had a brand new resolution, and it was utterly horrifying. She began starving herself to death. Finally, in October 1952, Susan Peters passed. Although the cause of her death was a chronic kidney infection, the doctors admitted she'd hastened her end by starvation and dehydration. the woman had clearly lost the desire to live. Only Peter's brother and his wife had been with her at the time of her passing. They laid her to rest in Forest Lawn Memorial Park, which is where her mom was also buried. She was only 31 years old. It is overwhelmingly sad to imagine how one accident destroyed Peters, the embodiment of so much promise and potential. But despite her short time in the spotlight, she will always be remembered. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next time.